As the war ended and Nazi Germany crumbled, its once indomitable military fortifications were left to silently decay across Europe. These massive concrete bunkers, built to withstand airstrikes and artillery, stood as eerie remnants of a failed empire. But what became of them in the aftermath of the war? Some were abandoned to the elements, others repurposed for military and civilian use. Today, many still stand, their crumbling walls a testament to the war's brutal legacy. Yet their transformation into memorials, museums, or forgotten ruins reflects Europe's uneasy reconciliation with its past. What happened to these bunkers, and what do they reveal about history's relentless march forward? It is easy to imagine the colossal and indomitable strength of Nazi Germany, its power projected through vast, impregnable fortifications scattered across Europe. These bunkers were symbols of defiance, remnants of a regime that sought to control through fear, power, and relentless expansion. But what happened to these massive structures once the war ended? What became of these stone and steel monoliths, abandoned by their creators and left in a Europe that had already begun to rebuild? By May 1945, with the fall of Berlin, the Third Reich had collapsed. The sprawling network of bunkers, built to withstand air raids, artillery bombardments, and even direct assaults, were left behind. Thousands of them. From the dense forests of northern France to the coastlines of Norway, vast complexes of concrete, steel, and reinforced earth lay in disarray, abandoned by those who once relied on them for survival and power. Yet, these bunkers, so carefully constructed, so strategically placed, were now nothing more than silent sentinels of a vanished empire. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Europe was thrust into a desperate struggle for survival. Cities lay in ruins, food was scarce, and the very infrastructure of nations had been decimated. With much of the continent grappling with the immense task of rebuilding, the last thing on the minds of the Allied powers was the fate of Nazi bunkers. But as the dust settled and the realities of the post-war economy set in, the question of what to do with these fortifications would slowly rise to the surface. The bunkers were not just scattered along the coastlines, but also embedded deep into mountain ranges, perched on high cliffs, or tucked beneath the streets of cities. Some were remnants of the infamous Atlantic Wall, a massive defensive system designed to keep Allied forces from landing on Nazi-occupied territory. Others were part of a network designed to protect the leadership, factories, and critical infrastructure of the Reich. Now they stood empty, vast, impregnable structures that served no purpose. The war had been won, but the global economy was in ruins. Resources were scarce, priorities shifted to rebuilding, and many of the bunkers were in locations that were no longer strategically relevant. The question on many minds was, what was to become of these monuments to a failed ideology? On a practical level, it wasn't just a matter of ignoring them. The bunkers were immense, constructed with thick layers of concrete and steel. Demolition was an incredibly expensive proposition, often requiring specialized equipment and massive amounts of manpower. In countries like France and Belgium, the cost of tearing them down could easily have surpassed the cost of rebuilding other forms of infrastructure. For many nations, the resources simply weren't available to deal with these colossal structures. Instead, early efforts to dispose of the bunkers focused on simply leaving them. In some places, the bunkers were repurposed, hastily converted into storage depots, military supply houses, or even living quarters for displaced persons. Others, situated along coastlines, were abandoned to the elements, slowly decaying under the weight of history and nature. In Germany, the situation was more complicated. Here, some bunkers were preserved or refurbished, particularly those in cities like Berlin and Hamburg, where they had served as headquarters for the Nazi regime. These structures, once a symbol of oppression, now became relics of a fractured past. The denazification efforts that took hold of post-war Germany often clashed with the decision to preserve or demolish these bunkers. The Allies, in their effort to rebuild Germany and rid the country of Nazi influence, faced a dilemma. Would it be better to erase all traces of the regime, or would the removal of these bunkers be another form of denial? In some cases, the bunkers were simply forgotten, their locations too remote, their purpose too obscure to garner any attention. Over the years, these abandoned structures began to take on new, strange lives. In areas where economic collapse had taken hold, some were occupied by squatters, while others became hiding places for war criminals or black market traders. In the 1950s, as the Cold War loomed and tensions rose across Europe, many bunkers were rediscovered and repurposed by both NATO and the Warsaw Pact, the very same superpowers that had once fought each other for control of the continent. Across the continent, the fate of Nazi bunkers became a microcosm of post-war Europe's struggle with its past. The more destructive and yet oddly benign option was to simply leave them be, these titanic structures quietly wasting away. Even after decades, many of these bunkers continue to exist today, untouched by time and the ravages of modernity. Some have collapsed into themselves, their foundations weakened by years of neglect, their once imposing walls now cracked and crumbling. But others have been preserved, maintained as cultural monuments or tourist attractions. In Normandy, the remains of the Atlantic Wall are now points of interest for history buffs, military enthusiasts, and curious travelers. In other locations, the bunkers serve as quiet memorials to the tens of millions who perished during the war. And yet, their preservation does little to erase the stark reality of their original purpose. What was once a structure designed for war and terror has now, in many cases, become part of a grim tourism industry, where people come to see remnants of a past they can never fully understand or erase. In some cases, the bunkers were converted into spaces for innovation. One bunker in Berlin was transformed into an underground tech hub in the 1990s, a sharp contrast to its original role in Nazi defense strategies. Others were simply left as reminders, the decay of time itself contributing to their eerie presence on the landscape. But the story of what really happened to the abandoned Nazi bunkers after the war is not one of simple eradication. It's a tale of complexity, where forces of memory, politics, and economic constraints collided in ways that continue to echo through Europe's post-war history. In some cases, the bunkers were quietly discarded. In others, they were repurposed in ways that would have been unimaginable to their original builders. And in still others, they stand today as ghostly reminders of the darkest chapter of human history. The scale of this phenomenon is staggering. There are thousands of these bunkers across Europe. From the coastlines of France to the forests of Norway, from the cities of Germany to the villages of Belgium, the sheer number of these structures dwarfs most wartime monuments. And yet, despite their size and prominence, they often remain hidden in plain sight, unnoticed and uncared for. Some have been forgotten altogether, even as their hulking shapes loom over the landscape, half buried and half erased. In truth, the abandonment of Nazi bunkers after the war is not simply a story of concrete and steel. It is a story of the failure of an empire, a symbol of a past that refused to die, lingering like a scar on the face of Europe. The final fate of these bunkers, their ultimate destruction or transformation, would not come quickly, and the answers were often far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The fate of the Nazi bunkers after the war was neither singular nor straightforward. While some were obliterated, others stood stubbornly in defiance, converted into new purposes, or quietly decayed over time. The post-war period saw a variety of outcomes based on the economic, political, and social realities of the time. Across Europe, the response to these vast, often eerie remnants of a defeated regime varied greatly depending on location, necessity, and the resources available to governments struggling to rebuild after the devastation of war. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Europe was in a state of profound disarray. The vast scale of destruction left by the war had decimated entire cities, and the priority for most European nations was to reconstruct basic infrastructure: homes, schools, factories, roads. This urgency left little room for the large-scale removal or dismantling of the bunkers, many of which were situated in remote or hard-to-reach locations. The bunkers were initially seen not as monuments to the past but as obstacles, unwelcome remnants of an enemy whose ideals had been crushed, yet whose legacy remained stubbornly present in the landscape. One of the first responses to these structures, particularly in areas like northern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, was to simply leave them. The bunkers, massive and built to last, were costly to demolish. Many governments lacked the resources to either tear them down or repurpose them. This was especially true for nations struggling under the weight of occupation, war reparations, and internal displacement. In many instances, these concrete fortresses were simply left to decay, an enduring symbol of the brutality and terror that had once ruled over the region. In some cases, this inaction was deliberate. The bunkers, while formidable, were often isolated in locations that no longer held any strategic military value. The countries that had been occupied by Nazi forces were in no rush to repurpose or even preserve the bunkers. For some, they represented a painful reminder of their subjugation during the war. Removing them could be seen as a way of erasing a traumatic part of history, yet in doing so, they might risk sweeping away the memory of the occupation altogether. For others, the sheer scale of the structures made their demolition nearly impossible. Situated along the coastlines of France, along mountain ridges in Norway, or in dense forests in Belgium, the bunkers often found themselves isolated in places that made their destruction not only unfeasible but seemingly unnecessary. These untouched bunkers, left to slowly crumble, became silent witnesses to history, marking the landscape with their ghostly presence. But it wasn't long before the bunkers, once symbols of Nazi strength and intimidation, found new uses. The rise of the Cold War in the late 1940s and 1950s injected new life into many of these abandoned structures. As the ideological battle between the Soviet Union and the United States unfolded, both sides of the emerging superpower divide recognized the potential utility of the bunkers. Many of the Nazi-era fortifications, particularly those along Europe's coastlines, found new roles in the militarized atmosphere of the Cold War. For NATO, many of the bunkers along Europe's western perimeter were seen as vital infrastructure. With tensions mounting and the Soviet threat looming, these fortifications were refurbished, repurposed, and reinforced. Some of the bunkers that had once been part of the Atlantic Wall were now adapted for use by the Allied forces, their function shifting from defense against one enemy to defense against another. The bunkers, designed to protect against Allied invasions during the Second World War, now stood as crucial military installations in the Cold War's new era of high-stakes geopolitical struggle. Some bunkers, particularly in countries like Germany, were transformed into headquarters for military units or intelligence agencies. These structures, already equipped with reinforced steel and concrete, were ideal for housing sensitive operations away from the prying eyes of enemy forces. In West Germany, where the divisions between East and West were clearly drawn, bunkers became part of the fabric of the military-industrial complex that would define the post-war era. In some instances, bunkers were even used for storing armaments, explosives, and ammunition, continuing their original purpose of housing military resources, albeit in a dramatically different political context. While some bunkers were repurposed for military use, others were converted into civilian applications. In places where the economic situation was more stable, particularly in the United Kingdom and parts of France, several bunkers were refurbished as shelters for civilians in the event of future conflicts. Though these structures had been designed to withstand the worst military bombardments of their time, they now became tools for a new generation, intended to provide protection from an atomic threat rather than a conventional one. In other cases, the bunkers were repurposed as storage facilities, warehouses for everything from food and industrial goods to more mundane items like furniture and household products. Interestingly, some of the bunkers that had once served as symbols of Nazi power and terror were given a more public role in the 1950s and 1960s. In Germany, for example, some bunkers were maintained as historical landmarks, museums dedicated to the war and its legacy. The decision to preserve these bunkers as historical sites was not without its challenges. The very existence of the structures seemed to embody the ideology and terror of a failed regime. Yet in a Europe that was reconstructing itself, there was a belief that the war should not be forgotten, that these structures should stand as a reminder of what had transpired. And so, some of the bunkers were transformed into museums, places where visitors could learn about the horrors of the war, the role of Nazi Germany, and the bitter divisions that still shaped Europe. These museums, though controversial in some quarters, helped preserve the memory of the war, but they also sparked debates about the nature of historical preservation. Could one truly preserve a piece of history without inadvertently glorifying its origins? In some countries, these bunkers were seen as uncomfortable reminders of a traumatic past, while in others, they were regarded as necessary monuments to ensure that such a war would never be forgotten. And so, these relics, often standing as isolated and weathered structures, became paradoxical symbols of both historical tragedy and resilience. The fact that many of them still exist today, often in disrepair, but still present, speaks to their lasting imprint on the European landscape. For some bunkers, the passage of time was more unforgiving. Over the decades, natural decay and lack of maintenance caused many of these once imposing structures to deteriorate beyond repair. These structures, built to withstand the full brunt of military assault, ultimately proved vulnerable to the slow forces of nature, rain, wind, and shifting earth. Concrete crumbled, steel rusted, and the intricate designs that had once made these bunkers impregnable became weaknesses. In some cases, entire sections of bunkers collapsed, either due to the weight of time or because of the lack of upkeep after they were abandoned. Yet, despite this natural erosion, many still stand today, silent reminders of a war that ended over 70 years ago. In recent decades, the bunkers have been rediscovered in new and unexpected ways. As urban exploration became popular in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, many of these abandoned structures gained a second life as sites of curiosity and mystery. Modern-day explorers, drawn by a fascination with forgotten history, sought out these eerie remnants of the past. Armed with cameras and flashlights, they ventured into the darkness of these decaying fortifications, searching for remnants of the past. In this way, the bunkers became sites of personal discovery and reflection, offering a tangible link to a time long since gone.